The worst part about hunting narco submarines isn't that they're fast, it's that they're not. It's not that they're invisible, it's that they're designed to be forgettable. A fishing boat looks more suspicious than this thing will ever look, and that's precisely the point. But here's what almost nobody talks about when they catch one of these vessels. The moment they realize they've been intercepted, the entire economics of the operation flip into reverse. The cartel doesn't lose money on capture, they lose the money they were going to make. And they lose something worse, the operational knowledge of how they got detected. Because every bust teaches the next generation of smugglers something valuable. And the United States Coast Guard, in their moments of operational triumph, is actually training their adversaries. In June 2019, a semi-submersible cocaine vessel was crossing the Eastern Pacific. It was doing everything right. The crew had maintained radio silence. They were moving at 8 knots, slow enough to minimize acoustic signature, fast enough to make predictable progress. The hull was fiberglass, not steel. No sonar would ping it like a traditional submarine. The color was ocean gray. The profile was deliberately depressed below the waterline, showing nothing but a breathing snorkel and a reinforced cockpit barely taller than a man's shoulders. By every standard metric of stealth, this vessel should have been phantom-level invisible. But it wasn't invisible. And this is where the story stops being about interdiction and starts being about something far more dangerous: tactical signature analysis. Because the vessel was caught not by radar, not by sonar, not by any sophisticated sensor the United States military officially deploys. It was caught because of something the engineers who built it never accounted for. Something basic. Something they should have anticipated but didn't. The vessel was caught by its wake. A human eye watching from the beach might never catch it. But a surveillance aircraft equipped with electro-optical imaging and flying at 30,000 feet, tasked specifically with scanning for maritime anomalies, sees everything. The wake tells a story. It shows course. It shows speed. It shows displacement. And when you're running an operation against the most heavily surveilled ocean corridor in the Americas, you don't get to control what's looking for you. You get to control what you do about it once you've been found. The submarine crew had no way to know they'd already been compromised. No way to know that military sensors had already classified their vessel, logged its coordinates, and initiated the chain of command that would lead, inexorably, toward a Coast Guard cutter cutting through the waves at full throttle toward their position. What happened next is the part that gets replayed in training videos and tactical briefings around the world. What happened next is where theory meets saltwater and bullets. The cutter had minimal time. The submarine crew, once they understood they were being pursued, would make calculations about survival. They would weigh the cost of the cargo against the cost of capture. They would decide, very quickly, that the cocaine was more valuable sunk than surrendered. The interior hatches of these vessels are equipped with seacocks and scuttling mechanisms. Manual valves that, when opened, allow ocean water to flood the interior compartments. It's a dead man's switch, designed into the engineering. It ensures that if capture becomes inevitable, the evidence goes down with the boat. The crew might survive. The drugs don't. The Coast Guard had one window, 60 seconds, maybe less. The window closes the moment someone inside that submarine decides to open a valve. And so what unfolded was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in modern maritime interdiction. A trained operator, equipped with gear that weighs almost 40 pounds, launching himself from one moving vessel to another, across open water, in conditions that would make most people reconsider every life choice they'd made. He was aiming for the hull of a semi-submersible that was already being throttled down, already being maneuvered into a defensible position. He had to stick the landing. He had to reach the hatch. He had to pry it open before the scuttling mechanism was fully engaged. He made it. In the chronology of Coast Guard operations, in the history of narco submarine interdictions, this particular moment registered as something special, not because of the physical feat, not because of the bravery, though that's undeniable, but because of what it revealed about the strategic asymmetry of the operation. The cartel had invested millions in vessel design, crew training, operational security, and navigation. They had anticipated military radar, military aircraft, military vessels. What they had not fully anticipated was that their own physics, the displacement of water by their hull, the wake pattern created by their forward motion, would be their undoing. They had optimized for sensors. They had neglected the basics. But this is where the deeper story begins. Because once the submarine was secured, once the crew was detained, once the 17,000 pounds of cocaine was cataloged and processed, The real intelligence work started. Not the seizure, the analysis. What the Coast Guard and the broader maritime interdiction community wanted to understand was not just how to catch narco submarines, they already had tactics for that. What they wanted to understand was why the cartel kept building them, why they kept sending them, and what that pattern revealed about the evolution of drug trafficking in the Pacific. The narco submarine program didn't emerge from nowhere. It evolved in response to enforcement. In the 1990s, when the U.S. military and Coast Guard flooded the Caribbean with radar and patrol vessels, drug traffickers adapted. They moved their operations to the Pacific side of Central America. When surface vessels with radar signatures became too vulnerable, they invested in submarines. When submarines became the target, they engineered semi-submersibles, vessels that could operate in shallow water, could be sunk on demand, and could be built in jungle yards using materials that were either cheap or dual-use enough to avoid suspicion. The entire ecosystem of narco submarine innovation is a direct response to the ecosystem of interdiction. It's an arms race played out across thousands of square miles of ocean, with billions of dollars and thousands of lives as the currency. What's remarkable is that the Coast Guard's institutional knowledge about how frequently these vessels actually succeed is classified. They catch maybe 1 in 10. That means 9 out of 10 narco submarines make it to their destination. 9 out of 10. Which means that every single interdiction, every single bust, every single operational success is statistically a drop in an ocean of smuggling activity. The system is optimized for visible failure, not for successful prevention. The public sees the Coast Guard victory. The military sees the catch, the cargo, the crew arrested. But the cartels see something different. They see that if they build 10 boats, 9 will arrive safely. They see that the probability of any individual vessel being caught is low enough to justify the operational risk. They see that the cost of losing 1 boat is absorbed by the profit margin on the 9 that succeed. This single narco submarine captured in June of 2019 represented approximately $250 million in street value cocaine. It also represented 1 boat. By the cartel's mathematics, 9 others were either already in transit or in planning stages. The U.S. interdiction system had not defeated narco submarine trafficking. It had priced it. It had not eliminated it. It had incentivized adaptation. And that's the part of the story that almost never makes it into the official press releases or the celebration videos. That's the part that lives in the classified assessments and the strategic threat evaluations that get briefed to Congress behind closed doors. The crew aboard that submarine in June 2019 had made a specific calculation about who they were and what they could accomplish. They were not operating under the assumption that they would not be caught. They were operating under the assumption that the probability of capture was acceptable, that the timeline was manageable, and that if everything went wrong, the worst outcome, personal detention, was something the organization had protocols for. The cartel maintains what amounts to a maritime insurance program. If crews are captured, families are paid. If vessels are seized, the cost is written off. The entire operation functions as a distributed network, which means no single component failure threatens the entire system. You can lose a submarine. You can lose a crew. You can lose a cargo. And the organization survives. In fact, it adapts. What most people don't understand about narco submarine crews is that they're not disposable, but they're also not uniquely irreplaceable. They're trained, they're competent, they understand oceanography, diesel engines, fiberglass repair, and how to survive in confined spaces for extended periods. But there's a steady supply of people willing to take the risk. The cartel recruits from coastal communities, from families with maritime tradition, from people who understand boats and understand poverty. They offer salaries that would take a decade of legitimate fishing to earn, payable in a single trip. For a crew member who makes $300 a month as a fisherman, the opportunity to make $10,000 for a single operation is not a calculation about abstract risk. It's a calculation about feeding your family. And that's the leverage structure that allows the system to sustain itself indefinitely. The single narco submarine captured in 2019 was one story, but it was also a data point in a much larger pattern. It taught the military something about detection methods. It taught them that wake analysis, combined with persistent surveillance, could locate vessels that were otherwise invisible to conventional sensors. It taught them that the window for interdiction was smaller than they thought, 60 seconds, give or take. And it taught them that the crews were disciplined enough, trained enough, and motivated enough to actually execute the scuttling protocols if given the chance. All of this information fed back into strategic planning. It informed the next generation of tactics. It was used to brief naval officers, Coast Guard commanders, and policymakers about the true nature of the threat. And in that briefing cycle, something important happened. The military acknowledged, for the first time officially, that they were not winning the narco submarine war. They were managing it. Management is different from victory. Victory suggests that the problem is being solved. Management suggests that the problem is being contained, monitored, and adapted to. And if you understand that distinction, you understand why the narco submarine program has not only survived the last 20 years of U.S. interdiction efforts, but has actually accelerated. More submarines are being built now than at any point in the past decade. Construction techniques are improving. Crews are being trained with more rigor. The entire ecosystem is becoming more professional, more efficient, and more resistant to disruption. The single submarine captured in 2019 was a success story for the Coast Guard. It was a tragedy for the cartel crew and a victory for the rule of law. But it was also a data point that confirmed what strategic analysts already suspected. The system was not breaking. It was evolving. If you want to understand how narco submarines actually fit into the broader drug trafficking architecture, there's far more detail available in the pinned comment and in the channel description. I've linked to strategic assessments and intelligence community evaluations that break down exactly how these vessels function as part of a larger supply chain and what that means for the future of maritime security in the Western Hemisphere. This is the kind of operational intelligence that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, but it's absolutely critical for understanding why the interdiction numbers look the way they do. The crew aboard that June 2019 submarine didn't know about the statistics. They didn't know about the strategic assessments or the congressional briefings or the long-term forecasts about maritime drug trafficking. They knew they had a job. They knew they had a destination. They knew they had maybe 90% odds of success. And they knew that if something went wrong, the organization would take care of them. What they didn't know was that their wake would be visible from 30,000 feet. They didn't know that a surveillance aircraft, designed to hunt supersonic weapons systems, could be repurposed to hunt semi-submersibles in the Pacific. They didn't know that their physics was their vulnerability. They thought their engineering was their advantage. In the history of asymmetric warfare, this kind of mismatch, where the defender understands something about the system that the attacker has failed to account for, is often the moment where everything changes. But narco submarines don't exist in isolation. They exist within an ecosystem that's constantly learning, constantly evolving. Every interdiction teaches lessons. Every escaped submarine teaches lessons. Every new detection method gets analyzed, assessed, and worked around. The cartel's intelligence operation, and yes, they run something that functions very much like an intelligence operation, is watching the same data the military is watching. When the 2019 submarine was caught, the cartel didn't just lose a boat and a cargo. They gained information about how they were detected. They learned that wake analysis was viable. They learned that persistent overhead surveillance could identify targets from extreme altitude. And within months, they were implementing countermeasures, slower speeds, erratic course changes, multiple vessels moving in clusters to make pattern analysis harder, different routing to avoid known surveillance corridors. The game between interdiction and smuggling is not a game that ends. It's a game that continues indefinitely, with each side learning from the other, adapting, innovating, and escalating. The United States has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in maritime surveillance infrastructure. They have satellites, aircraft, ships, submarines, sonobuoys, radar systems, and human intelligence networks. And still, 9 out of 10 narco submarines make it through. When you see those statistics, when you really understand what they mean, the single successful interdiction in June 2019 looks a lot less like a victory and a lot more like proof of concept. Proof that the system works sometimes. Proof that the tactics are sound. But also proof that the scale of the problem is fundamentally different from the scale of the response. The odds are not with interdiction, they're with smuggling. And that's a structural problem that no individual tactical victory can solve. But what happened next reveals something far more troubling about this entire operation. The moment those Coast Guard personnel secured the hatch, The men inside made a split-second decision that would change the entire tactical calculus of what was happening on the surface. They began the deliberate process of activating the flooding valves. This wasn't panic. This wasn't desperation. This was cold, calculated protocol. They were going to sink $75 million in narcotics rather than let it fall into American hands. And they were going to do it in under 2 minutes. The Coast Guard boarding team understood immediately that they were in a race against both the ocean and the clock. Water was already beginning to pour in through the opened valves. The submarine's weight distribution was changing by the second. Soon it would be too heavy to keep afloat. Soon it would become a tomb. So they did something that shouldn't have been possible. They manually sealed the internal valves from the outside, reversing the sinking mechanism before the fiberglass hull took on enough seawater to become a permanent grave. What they recovered wasn't just a shipment of cocaine. It was evidence. Evidence of something much larger than any single operational success. Because here's what most people don't understand about these narco submarines. They're not built by cartels with unlimited resources and access to military-grade engineering. They're built by people. People with knowledge, yes. People with determination, absolutely. But people working with improvised tools, salvaged materials, and problem-solving under extreme constraints. These are jungle shipyards. We're talking about dense rainforest locations in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, where criminal organizations have established clandestine construction facilities. These aren't facilities with blueprints or engineering degrees. They're facilities with experience, trial and error, generational knowledge passed between smugglers about what works and what sinks. The original narco submarines were crude, absolutely primitive by any modern standard. They were essentially fiberglass tubes welded together by hand, powered by salvage diesel engines, and manned by crews who had never received formal maritime training. The earliest versions often leaked. Many sank. Some were discovered before they ever left port, because the construction quality was so obviously deficient. But failure is information, and information can be applied to the next design, to the next hull, to the next attempt. By the time this particular submarine made its run in 2019, the technology had evolved significantly from those early prototypes. The vessel measures approximately 40 feet in length. That's longer than a standard school bus. The construction uses a combination of fiberglass and steel, handmade but increasingly refined with each iteration. The engine is a simple diesel unit, the kind you might find in a fishing boat or agricultural equipment. The fuel capacity allows these vessels to travel up to 4,000 nautical miles without refueling. That's far enough to reach the continental United States from South American ports. The crew compartment is deliberately minimal. 4 to 6 people, standing room only, sitting on fuel drums, crammed into a space that resembles a submarine you might see in a museum, rather than anything that resembles comfortable accommodations. But the real engineering breakthrough wasn't in the hull or the engine. It was in what they couldn't detect. Narco submarines generate almost no acoustic signature. They move slowly enough that they barely disturb the water around them. Their fiberglass composition creates a minimal radar return. They sit so low in the water that from even a few hundred meters away, they're virtually invisible to the human eye. The only consistent way to spot them historically has been through the most mundane detail imaginable: their wake. This is why intelligence agencies began deploying high-altitude surveillance aircraft equipped with sophisticated optical and infrared cameras. These aircraft don't use radar in the traditional sense. They use their eyes. They scan hundreds of square miles of ocean per flight, looking for that telltale white line in the water that indicates a moving object: a fishing boat, a cargo vessel, a yacht, or a narco submarine moving toward the coast. The aircraft that spotted this particular submarine in June 2019 was performing a routine patrol. The operator wasn't looking for anything specific. He was simply monitoring the water as part of ongoing surveillance operations across the Eastern Pacific. And then he saw it. Not the submarine itself. The aircraft was too high for that level of detail. But the wake. A thin white line moving through the water in a pattern that didn't match any known civilian vessel. It wasn't moving fast enough to be a naval vessel. It wasn't moving in the pattern of a fishing fleet. It was moving in the pattern of something that was deliberately trying to minimize detection. Something that wanted to stay off the radar in every sense except the one way it couldn't hide from: the physics of its own movement through water. So the information was transmitted down the chain of command. A suspicious vessel detected. Coordinates recorded. A response was dispatched. And that's where the boarding team comes back into the picture. Because finding a narco submarine is one problem. Actually stopping it, boarding it, and preventing the crew from destroying the evidence is an entirely different problem. This is the part that doesn't get discussed in the official press releases. This is the part that reveals the extreme danger of what these interdiction teams actually do. When a narco submarine is spotted and a boarding team is called in, those teams know several things with absolute certainty. First, the crew will resist. Second, the crew will attempt to sink the vessel rather than allow capture. Third, the ocean is not a forgiving environment for a tactical mistake, so the approach needs to be aggressive, fast, and overwhelming. The team needs to reach the vessel before the crew can implement their self-destruction protocol. They need to board it while it's still moving. They need to do this in rough water. They need to do this without killing anyone unnecessarily. And they need to do all of this while the men inside are actively making decisions to sink the ship. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you look at the statistics, the system appears to be failing. 9 out of 10 narco submarines get through. But there's a hidden metric in those numbers that almost nobody discusses. It's the ones that don't get through. It's not just about interdiction. It's about how the very existence of an interdiction capability changes behavior across the entire network. When a submarine is caught, that information propagates back through the smuggling network. New operational procedures are implemented. Routes are adjusted. Technology is refined. The submarine designs get better because the designers now know more specifically what failed and what succeeded. This creates a feedback loop where the smugglers are constantly iterating based on what the interdiction teams are doing, and the interdiction teams are constantly trying to anticipate what new tactics the smugglers will employ. It's an arms race conducted in slow motion across an ocean that's too vast for traditional military concepts to apply effectively. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because it reveals something that governments rarely want to admit. You can have the best surveillance infrastructure on the planet. You can have satellites that cost billions of dollars. You can have aircraft that can read a license plate from the stratosphere. You can have ships, submarines, radar systems, sonobuoys, and human intelligence networks. But if your adversary is patient, distributed, and willing to operate with extremely low profit margins, they can still get through. Not every time, but often enough to make it economically viable. If you want a deeper breakdown of how asymmetric maritime warfare actually works, I've put together a comprehensive resource in the description and in the pinned comment that walks through the specific interdiction tactics, detection methodologies, and evasion strategies that both sides are currently employing. The crew of that June 2019 submarine didn't understand that they were participating in something far larger than a single drug run. They were participating in a technological and tactical evolution that was being observed, analyzed, and fed back into the system. Their vessel was going to be examined. Every structural detail would be documented. Every design choice would be evaluated. The Americans would send that information through classified channels to their counterparts in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. They would share findings with allied intelligence services. And somewhere in a cartel-controlled shipyard in the Colombian jungle, someone would receive word that the vessel had been captured and sunk. And then they would build a better one. This is where the real story begins. Not in the ocean, but in the shipyards hidden deep within the Colombian interior. These aren't industrial facilities you'll find on Google Maps. They're improvised construction zones carved into the rainforest, where cartel engineers operate with zero oversight, zero regulation, and zero accountability. And crucially, zero constraints on innovation. The submarine that was captured in June 2019 had already taught the cartel something invaluable. American detection methods were improving. The high-altitude surveillance aircraft had spotted its wake. That meant the next generation needed to be quieter, lower profile, even harder to see. The cartel didn't have access to classified defense budgets or advanced materials science labs, but they had something potentially more dangerous. They had motivation, time, and a willingness to experiment with whatever worked. Within months of that capture, new designs began emerging from the jungle. Some were subtle modifications, slightly different hull angles to reduce radar reflection. Others were more radical. Cartel engineers started experimenting with materials that American radar struggled to penetrate. They studied the captured vessel's design flaws and systematized improvements. They were reverse engineering their own failure. By 2020, the vessels coming out of these jungle yards were noticeably different. The cockpit design had changed. The snorkel placement had shifted. Some used different propulsion systems. And the Coast Guard noticed. Every interdiction, every captured submarine, became intelligence for the cartel. Every intelligence briefing the Americans conducted became a blueprint for improvement. It was a direct feedback loop of tactical evolution, and the Americans were accelerating it. This is where conventional military analysis breaks down. The cartel wasn't fighting the Coast Guard with bigger submarines. They were fighting with smarter ones. And in asymmetric warfare, smarter almost always beats bigger. A $10 million submarine that evades detection is worth more to a trafficking organization than a $50 million asset that gets seized. The equation wasn't about firepower or displacement. It was about invisibility and success rate. The real tactical pressure wasn't on the submarines themselves. It was on the surveillance and interdiction systems that hunted them. The United States Coast Guard operates with a finite number of cutter vessels, a limited number of surveillance aircraft, and a specific operational tempo. They can't patrol the entire Eastern Pacific simultaneously. What they do instead is predictable. They concentrate assets in known transit corridors. They establish patterns. They operate according to a schedule. The cartels study this. They have scouts, they have informants, they have analysts just like we do. They watch where the Coast Guard concentrates its forces. They observe the temporal patterns, when flights increase, when cutter activity peaks, when interdiction probability is lowest. And they route their submarines accordingly. A perfectly designed vessel is worthless if it's sent through waters where American assets are actively searching. But an imperfect vessel sent through a blind spot in the surveillance grid at exactly the right moment, that reaches its destination undetected. This is the actual calculus of modern smuggling operations. It's not about building the perfect submarine. It's about understanding the detection grid, the interdiction capabilities, the operational constraints, and the human patterns that govern the American response. By 2021, the Coast Guard's own reports indicated that cartels had developed sophisticated intelligence operations specifically designed to track and predict American interdiction efforts. They were running counterintelligence against the most advanced maritime power on the planet. And here's what makes this genuinely strategic. The submarines themselves were almost secondary. What mattered was the information ecosystem surrounding them. Cartel organizations maintain networks of sources inside port authorities, inside shipping companies, inside government agencies in Central and South America. They had vessel tracking data. They had communication intercepts. They had early warning systems that would alert them the moment a Coast Guard cutter left port or an aircraft launched for a patrol mission. The submarine that was captured in June 2019 wasn't just a vessel. It was proof of concept. It demonstrated that a cartel-built craft could transit hundreds of miles through the most surveilled maritime zone on Earth. Yes, it was eventually intercepted, but it had already succeeded in its primary objective. It had proven the operational model was viable, and every subsequent submarine that left the jungle shipyards benefited from that knowledge. By the time we reached 2022 and 2023, the submarines had evolved again. Some were built with dual-hull designs. Some incorporated more sophisticated ballast systems. Some were designed to carry even heavier loads, not 17,000 pounds of cocaine, but 25,000. The payload capacity increased because the design efficiency had improved. The cartels were operating on a curve of continuous improvement, and American surveillance and interdiction strategies couldn't keep pace. This is where the operational narrative diverges from what you'll read in most analyses. The Coast Guard's success rate on Narco submarine interdiction has remained relatively static, around 11 to 15% of known or suspected vessels. What's changed is the total volume of attempted transits. If smuggling organizations are dispatching twice as many submarines, and the Coast Guard is still only catching 15%, then the absolute number of successful deliveries is increasing, not decreasing. The submarines that don't get caught, and statistically, most don't, arrive at their destinations. They offload their cargo. The vessels are either scuttled, stripped for parts, or hidden in clandestine storage facilities along the coast. Some are reused for additional runs. Some are disassembled, and their components are recycled into new vessels. Nothing goes to waste in this economy. What we're witnessing here is actually a profound failure of a specific type of military strategy. The United States has been attempting to solve a logistical problem, moving cocaine from South America to North American markets. The assumption was that if you increase surveillance, increase patrols, increase interceptions, you can reduce the flow. But the cartels have demonstrated that's not how trafficking networks function at scale. For every submarine that gets seized, there are legitimate cargo containers. There are fishing vessels. There are merchant ships using false manifests. There are speedboats that make short runs across the Gulf of Mexico. There are underground tunnels that connect Mexico to the United States. There are commercial airports with corrupt officials. There are mail delivery services. There are cryptocurrency networks. There are money laundering operations so sophisticated they make Fortune 500 companies look amateurish. The submarine interdiction, the dramatic one we're discussing, captures media attention and generates headlines for the Coast Guard. But it's fundamentally a distraction from the actual scale of the trafficking operation. It's like announcing you've prevented a flood by installing a bucket in one small room while ignoring the dam that's broken behind the house. The submarines matter for a different reason than interdiction effectiveness. They matter because they represent a fundamental shift in how criminal organizations approach logistics and innovation. The cartels aren't primitive, they're not unsophisticated, they're running operations that incorporate surveillance analysis, materials engineering, intelligence collection, and tactical adaptation. They're studying American military doctrine and developing countermeasures. They're building institutional knowledge and passing it between operational cells. Every submarine that's captured and sunk teaches them something. Every submarine that successfully transits teaches them something different. The feedback mechanisms work in both directions. And because cartel organizations operate without the bureaucratic constraints that govern American military agencies, they can adapt faster. They can test new designs, implement changes in weeks rather than years, and scale solutions across their network rapidly. This is the hidden tactical reality of the Narco submarine phenomenon. It's not really about the submarines at all. It's about the organizational capacity to innovate under pressure, to learn from failure, and to systematically improve operational effectiveness in response to external threats. The cartels have developed these capabilities because trafficking cocaine is their core business. Their survival depends on it. They've invested in the infrastructure of learning and adaptation. The Americans, by contrast, operate within a system where budget cycles, procurement processes, and interagency coordination move at glacial speed. A new surveillance technology might take 3 to 5 years to develop, test, approve, and deploy. By that time, cartel engineers have already adapted. By the time American strategy adjusts to the new submarine designs, the cartels have moved on to the next iteration. And that's the asymmetry that matters most in this conflict. It's not about military hardware. It's about institutional speed and adaptive capacity. And on that metric, the cartels are winning. Which brings us to the real question, and the one that keeps maritime strategists awake at night. If the cartels can outmaneuver the most powerful military on the planet, what does that tell us about asymmetric warfare in the 21st century? The Narco submarine isn't just a vessel. It's a symbol of a larger strategic reality, that innovation, speed, and institutional hunger can sometimes overcome surveillance systems worth billions of dollars. It's proof that the war on drugs, as currently structured, isn't primarily a military problem. It's an adaptation problem. And whoever adapts faster wins. The Coast Guard, to their credit, still manages to intercept roughly 11% of these vessels. That's not nothing. 11% of a multi-billion-dollar trafficking operation represents significant disruption. Millions in seized cocaine, crews arrested, vessels destroyed. But from a strategic perspective, it's a holding action. It's not a solution. It's a constant game of tactical catch-up against an enemy that has already moved 10 steps ahead. Some defense analysts argue the answer isn't in the water at all. It's inland. It's about disrupting the supply chains before they ever reach the ocean. It's about targeting the financiers, the engineers, the operational planners. It's about intelligence work that happens in boardrooms and safe houses, not on radar screens. Others propose a different approach entirely, accept that some cocaine will get through, but focus maximum effort on the final mile, the delivery point, the distribution network, the street-level disruption. Make it so expensive and dangerous to sell that the trafficking becomes economically unviable. That's a different war than the one being fought in the Pacific. But there's something else happening here that's worth understanding. The Narco submarine represents a shift in how non-state actors wage strategic competition. They're not trying to match the American military. They don't care about supersonic jets or aircraft carriers. They're finding asymmetries, places where institutional constraints matter more than raw capability. The Coast Guard officer who jumped onto that submarine hull in 2019 was brave. The decision to risk his life was correct. The operation was tactically perfect. But that single intercept doesn't change the strategic reality. Tomorrow, the cartel builds a new submarine. The engineers incorporate lessons learned from the capture. The next vessel is slightly quieter, slightly less visible, slightly harder to intercept. And the cycle continues. This is the nature of asymmetric conflict in an age of rapid adaptation. The side with more resources doesn't always win. The side with faster learning cycles does. And if you want to understand how this applies beyond just drug trafficking, there's a resource in the description and pinned comment that breaks down the broader doctrine of asymmetric adaptation, how smaller, hungrier organizations consistently outpace massive bureaucratic institutions. It's worth reading before you leave today. The real takeaway from the 2019 Narco submarine capture isn't that law enforcement won a victory. It's that they caught a glimpse of a much larger struggle that they're slowly losing. And understanding that dynamic, understanding how cartels think about innovation, how they recruit talent, how they iterate faster than their adversaries, is crucial if you want to make sense of modern warfare and covert operations. The cartels have figured out something that governments struggle with. Survival depends on constant evolution. Every loss teaches them. Every failed submarine informs the next design. Every captured crew member's interrogation details inform security protocols. They operate in a feedback loop of learning and adaptation. Meanwhile, government agencies operate in budgeting cycles. They operate in political windows. They operate in procurement bureaucracies where a single new surveillance system can take 5 years to approve and deploy. By the time it's operational, the threat has transformed into something unrecognizable. This isn't a criticism of individual Coast Guard personnel or military leaders. They're working within systems that are fundamentally constrained. It's a structural problem, and structural problems require structural solutions. Some analysts suggest that the only way to win this arms race is to fundamentally reorganize how intelligence and enforcement agencies operate, push authority down, reduce approval cycles, allow field commanders to make faster decisions, fund innovation in real time instead of budgeting for it years in advance. In other words, become more like the cartels, leaner, hungrier, faster to adapt. Whether that's politically possible is another question entirely. Governments aren't designed to move at cartel speed. They're designed to move at national scale with public accountability. Those are virtues in most contexts. But in an arms race with non-state actors, they're constraints. The Narco submarine, then, isn't just a smuggling vessel. It's a window into how power operates in the 21st century. It shows us that surveillance doesn't equal control, that technology doesn't equal victory, that the institution with the biggest budget doesn't always win against the institution with the fastest learning cycle. And if you want to go deeper on how these dynamics apply to drone warfare, cyber operations, sanctions evasion, and intelligence gathering, how the asymmetric advantage keeps shifting in real time, check the description and the pinned comment for a full resource that walks through case studies, strategic frameworks, and what this all means for the future of conflict. The reality that emerges from studying operations like the 2019 submarine intercept is this. Wars are won not just by those with the most firepower, but by those with the most adaptive capacity. The cartels understand this. They've built their entire operational structure around rapid learning and quick iteration, until the institution